Hello and welcome to Dialogue. Global governance has been one of the major focuses of international society, in particular in the pursuit of a genuine democratic process. As global conflicts intensify and challenges increase around the world, people have become more skeptical of the effectiveness of the existing global order and institutions, and that they can promote true justice and democracy for all regions of the world. Is there a better form of a global governance? What could a genuine worldwide democratic process look like? Join us for our discussion today from Beijing. I'm Xu Qinduo. Joining me today is Dr. Jan Oberg, Director of the Transnational Foundation for Peace and Future Research. Welcome to Dialogue, Dr. Oberg.
Many thanks. My pleasure.
You have called for a genuine democratic process that incorporates global cooperation. Tell us more about this pursuit or this definition here.
Well, we're moving into a globalizing world. We've been for a long time. The future basic unit of the international society will not be nation states or countries as we know them today. It will be regions. And that means it's not enough that people can vote for their national governments. They must also be able to vote and participate at higher levels, so to speak. So I believe that when the US empire has gone, and thereby NATO too, we will have a good opportunity to make a global, to create a global governance. I'm not saying government, because that would be a dangerous institution with so much power, but a governance. That is a new way of making global decisions together.
It sounds, it is an urgent task for us to restructure a new global democratic system, is it?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. We should have been discussing this long ago because everybody can see where we're moving. Nation states are not that important. We're going into a transnational world where citizens will interact with citizens everywhere else and not through their governments or representatives. And secondly, we're in a situation in which the old order is giving way to the new, and it's a dangerous period with militarism and warfare and genocide and stuff like that. And I would add also the opportunity we have now, or in the very near future, is to build a world with much less violence. Democracy is about dialogue. It's about talking with each other, consulting each other, listening to each other. Whereas weapons, nuclear weapons in particular, is about force. It's about not listening to people, but threatening them and eventually killing them if somebody thinks there's a need for that. So with democracy, we also, let's say, disarm and create a new way of living together and solving conflicts in a democratic way, not by militarism and warfare, but by talking to each other. That's why democracy is so important.
Democracy is important, of course, but what we're seeing is that, the US, has been hosting or co-hosting with other countries the Global Democracy Summit, but some criticism have pointed out these kind of moves are basically dividing the world, creating different probably camps like us versus them, democracies versus so-called undemocratic countries or autocracies, as the US said. So what's your view on that? Is that about dialogue? Is that about cooperation?
No, that particular summit that you mentioned lacked a lot of countries, as we all know, and was more a public relation, not a very successful one for the so-called democracy in the United States, which is in deep crisis, as everybody can see, probably except the Americans themselves, or the leaders or the presidential candidates. But I think that, we're touching upon an important issue, namely, like human rights, democracy and freedom have different implementations. I think we all have a sense of what it is, kind of, But then comes culture, history, people's norms, ways of thinking, etc., and they are different around the world, and therefore there cannot be one model that fits everybody in terms of democracy or human rights. And I think I'm a staunch believer in diversity or unity in diversity and not unity in uniformity. And that's why I think the Western missionary seal that everybody should be like the West and have the same political, economic, etc., or human rights system is basically wrong. And fortunately, in my view, it's coming to an end now. The US will be one of the poles. NATO will disappear. Nuclear weapons will disappear because they're illegal, according to the UN Charter and the Treaty for Nuclear Abolition. So, long story short, we are opening up a chapter of human civilization which potentially is very positive, and I refuse for one to be depressed or repressed by all this talk about warfare. I know the situation is very dangerous, but sometimes those dangerous periods give way to something new being born, and that's what I hope we'll focus on in this conversation.
Recently, French President Macron talked about this. Probably we should not set red lines for us in terms of supporting Ukraine. And of course, the Russian President Vladimir Putin earlier talked about, if they are cornered, the use of nuclear weapons cannot be ruled out. Are we facing the real dangers? And some people will even call it the possibility of the World War III. How dangerous is that?
Well, you might say that the World War III has gone on all the time since the second one in different parts of the world, but not as one big thing like the Second World War. I believe that this is an example where we could talk about who is the French president or the leadership, Madame von der Leyen in Europe, to talk about warfare that would, let's say, kill me, my family, my children, and my grandchildren. I've never elected these people. I've never voted for them. I voted for somebody in my national parliament or whatever, but I never voted for these people. And I think the decision to go to war is the most important decision a government can make. And therefore, it has to be something that is discussed very thoroughly, something that only people can decide who have a democratic mandate to do so. So leaders, these elite people who belong, by the way, to what I call MIMAC, the military industrial media academic complex, MIMAC, they are not elected, and they have no right to talk about possibilities of killing citizens in the millions for no good reason, if you will. There's never a good reason for warfare, but my point is, if democracy works, then we have a completely different discussion, and one that includes a negotiated solution, a discussion that includes visions about a Ukraine that could be safe but not a member of NATO. Discussions about how to stop have a ceasefire both in Ukraine and Gaza. Discussions about how to solve conflicts in Europe with much less violence. Discussions about how to bring the United Nations peacekeeping into these areas where we have huge problems. You may say there are a lot of problems with the United Nations. I don't disagree with that. But the Charter is the best piece of paper governments have ever signed. And until we have something better, we should be very careful. We should care enormously for the United Nations Charter, what the UN can do that no country can do. And I'm always glad when I see representatives of Chinese foreign policy emphasize international law, not this stupid, rules-based international order, which is an American way of legitimizing what they do against international law, but international law based on the UN Charter. That is the way ahead also to global democracy. However, having said that, we need reforms of the United Nations, but don't touch the Charter. Make the members good members of the UN. Don't criticize the UN, criticize the way you're a UN member, because most countries in this world are on a 24/7 basis violating the Charter of the United Nations that they've all signed, such as peace should be established by peaceful means. That's Article 1. Nobody does that. Mm-hmm. Nobody respects it.
Indeed, there's a need of efforts, let's say, to restructure, if not like reestablish a new global democratic process or system there. Part, of course, in the European Union continent, there are dangers, surrounding the Ukraine conflicts.
Yes.
A larger tension, probably large picture of tension, or even with, some say the probably more dangerous is the U.S. Policy on China, containment of China, for example. Part of that, let's say, U.S. would say, countries like China is not democratic, and they don't have, say, good governance, probably, because without a good democracy, you don't have good governance. So accusations, in terms of human rights, in terms of freedom, in terms of, ethnic minority, a lot of criticism on China. What do you make of that? The moves, by the United States here.
Well, the foundation of which I'm the director, the Transnational Foundation that you have up here, has published 2 years ago a large report on what we call the Cold War, not least through media, the Cold War of the US and the West against China. I think it's very unfair. I think it's substantially wrong. And I think, if you ask me, the United States, but in particular, should shut up. Because if you have your special operating forces 10 kilometers outside mainland China, which is what the US, according to some reports, will have, and you arm Taiwan and you do all these things in total violation of the communique between President Nixon and Chu Enlai about 50 years ago, if I remember correctly. I mean, there is no way you can argue that that is a threat to the West. But the West needs threats. The West needs somebody to legitimate its own armament and confrontational policies with. I mean, what would the West do if there was no Russia and China and Iran? They would have to pack up the military-industrial media academic complex. So good-hearted people believe that first you make a threat analysis and then you adapt your necessary, military expenditures and structures of defense forces to fit that basic threat. That's not the way it works. We have a military-industrial media academic complex, as I said. And when that gets to produce its weapons and export them and earn money and power and all that among a little elite that is not under democratic control, by the way, then you need enemies, images of enemies to legitimate what you do.
In the recent speech, you also stressed this point. Here's a quote, I think it will boost global democracy the day the US empire and NATO is gone, as you mentioned, because it's incompatible with the idea of democracy to have one trying to dominate the rest. Are you saying that we need to more equal, equal participation and equal representation from the global South or global majority here?
Absolutely. It's always been a screwed up world the last 300 years. There's nothing new in that. I mean, that's why countries went through a decolonization, struggled for their independence and all that, and still they're not economically independent, but they will be. We will have collective self-reliance. We will have the Belt and Road Initiative. We will have new relations when the US empire has disappeared and NATO doesn't exist. People will open up, countries will open up, but want to work with the US again, but not under these circumstances. So yes, I think there are lots of things that will change. But I have to say, if we survive the next year or two from these warmongers around Ukraine, and of course, let's not forget Gaza, the terrible genocide that happens there, live streamed with the full support of the Western world, is disgusting to see, in my view.
Well, on this military-industrial complex, earlier you mentioned about, probably should also include the academia and also the media there. The recent example is like there's a report about the CIA basically spreading rumors, make up stories of how bad China is, basically to attack the Chinese government or China in the Chinese media or around the world. So that is the involvement of more than the media. But again, if you look at the export of arms, U.S. is number one. U.S. has making a hell amount of money, let's say. And then recently, the Hungary's Prime Minister Viktor Orban, visited Trump. Trump said that, no single penny of the U.S. will go to Ukraine when he is elected. And then people would ask, what about this military-industrial complex? They will not be happy. So what's your reading into that?
President Eisenhower in the early 60s, in his farewell speech, mentioned what he called the military-industrial complex, MIC. I've expanded a little bit on it. The Western world and other countries around the world have not done anything to stop that military-industrial media academic complex. These elites are on the same line, and they are against their own people. They are profiting themselves in different ways, and they are doing things against their people. That's why I say it's not a democracy anymore, because a democracy does not have a military-industrial media academic complex. And so, in a way, and it's difficult to say this for an academic like me, you cannot understand international politics or Western policies anymore by means of political science or international relations or doctrine or rational analysis. That doesn't exist anymore. What we have is a series of social, psychological, political, psychological, psychopolitical mechanisms such as projection. And we're back to your question. Why does the West talk so negatively, consistently and all the time, 24/7, so negatively only about China and Russia and everybody else they don't like at the moment? It's projection of its own bad sides over upon the opponent or adversary that makes yourself feel good and also legitimates why you keep on doing bad things from your own dark corners. And that is a psychological theory. You can say that people who talk about now big war and nuclear war as a risk is rising and all that, they are doing eschatology. That is the idea of increasing the destruction until the end of the world. We're into something that is really much different from rational political decision-making that was the case when I was young. Now you're doing on emotionalism, populism, pop statements. I mean, the Swedish Prime Minister, when joining NATO, the Social Democratic female Prime Minister, Magdalena Andersson, when she handed in the application after the decision in the Swedish parliament, she said, NATO shall defend the Sweden that we love. I mean, if you bring love to your country into a discussion about the pros and cons, rational analysis, what is good, what is bad about NATO membership for Sweden, we've lost it. You cannot even discuss these things anymore because they have become so emotional. It comes from somewhere that, you can't analyze anymore. And that is dangerous.
Mm-hmm. I want your opinions probably on some more of the remarks by the Swedish Prime Minister. The Prime Minister pointed out that Europe need to do more on its part to convince the U.S. to keep its focus on Russia's war against Ukraine. This is about Europe. Of course, there are more about China too. The Prime Minister said that, EU or Sweden in NATO, agenda of Sweden in NATO is to work with the U.S. on its core strategic concern, which is China. It makes us feel puzzled about the Swedish policy.
Let me tell you, this is not out of the blue. This has been prepared basically since Olof Palme was killed, and I still wonder who killed him. It's been prepared since the so-called Russian submarines in 1981 went on ground, which turned out to be an American psyop. I mean, these things are nothing new. The membership of NATO is just the end station of it. But what I think you're referring to this speech, and at that time when it came out, I jokingly wrote, but seriously meant, on social media that the Prime Minister of Sweden, Mr. Kristersson, has already become very good at reading the mails he gets, his speech mails that he gets from Washington. This is not the words of a rational Swedish prime minister, neither the way Sweden became a member with 47% of the people behind and basically very screwed up, one-sided, biased public discussion with no criticism of NATO. And secondly, what I would really be well, critical is a weak word for it, but let me just say critical. On the third day, he was the prime minister. He went down to NATO's headquarters and gave a press conference. And in that one, he said, we will live up to, that's way back before Sweden formally became a member. Sweden will live up to all its obligations as a NATO member, including NATO's nuclear doctrine. The prime minister had no mandate for saying the last about the nuclear doctrine. You can be a member of NATO without participating or endorsing the nuclear doctrine. Mm-hmm. Now, NATO is an illegal organization because it is based on the weapons that shall be scrapped according to international law, the Treaty for Abolition of Nuclear Weapons. And secondly, he didn't have that mandate to say that. And the Swedish people have always been found nuclear weapons very problematic because back in time in the 50s and 60s, Sweden was able to produce a nuclear bomb. And that was a lengthy discussion, and not the least the women of the Social Democratic Party contributed to the decision that Sweden should not have its own nuclear weapons. Now we have nuclear weapons in the sense that the new agreement, the bilateral one, which is different from NATO membership, the bilateral one includes 17 US bases being established in Sweden, all over the place from the north to the south of this long country. There's been no public discussion about it. It will last for 10 years, and the Americans who are here, the 17 places, will be under American jurisdiction. That means we're not having a sovereign country anymore. And the decision-making was deeply showed deep contempt for the people and the public discussion about these things. So not only NATO membership, but also the fact that the US has now 17 bases and close to 40 new bases in the Scandinavian countries. This is absurd theater. This is emotionalism. It has nothing to do with rationality. All the Nordic countries will now be less secure than they were before. I'm totally convinced about that. I can't prove it, but I have my theories, and they are as good as the prime minister's.
Well, NATO, or people who defend NATO would say NATO is a defensive military bloc, a defensive, let's say, organization. It's like which is innocent, which is never or not involved in attacking offensive operation against other nations. And this year marks this 25th anniversary of NATO's bombing of Belgrade during this Kosovo war. And you were the mediator between Belgrade and the Kosovo leadership at the time. Tell us, when you look back and 25th anniversary, what are your thoughts?
Let me just quickly give you the three arguments why NATO is an offensive and not a defensive alliance. One is based on nuclear weapons. They are by definition never used on your own country, but on somebody else. So it's offensive. Secondly, it's based on offensive deterrence. That is, I'm able to kill you way far away from where you are. Whereas defensive deterrence would be, I'm able to make life very difficult for you if you come to my territory, but I cannot kill you where you are. And third, it's built on forward defense. All this can be read at NATO's homepage. And then they say, but politically, we're defensive. We will have all these offensive things in order to avoid a war. We don't want war with Russia. I mean, I'm beginning to wonder whether there's really a plan for war with Russia through Ukraine. Yes, I was a mediator for 4 years in the Kosovo-Serbia conflict. I was a personal advisor to the non-violent leadership of the Kosovo Albanians under Dr. Rugova in the 90s. I went out with my foundation and colleagues at the time, the team who worked with this, and said, for Christ's sake, don't bomb anywhere. We have developed a plan for 3 years, negotiated solution to the Kosovo problem. That is the only document that had a wide circulation when we published it, both in the Kosovo Albanian and Albanian press on the one side and on the Serbian Yugoslav press on the other side. Now, NATO went in and bombed the hell out of the place. And I say the hell out of the place because I was there during the bombings. And I can tell you it was not small bombs. But politically, what is very interesting and historic turning point is this was the first time that NATO broke its own treaty. And that's something that people should look into.
What's your outlook for a real democratic world in the foreseeable future?
Oh, I'm an optimist. It may sound strange for what we've been talking about, but I try to have a long-term perspective, and that's why I don't give up. My foundation is thriving on alternative analysis, because if you look at the long term, what the madness that we have now, the militarism, the war drums, all this cannot last. People will find out that they here in this part of the world that they are cheated or not told the whole truth by the media. Secondly, they will rise when they find out that the economic costs of this armament, things will disappear from the shelves of Europe, prices will be outrageous, etc. You'll have protests. So I count on this militarism to be so self-defeating that we will have to do something new. Now, I'm still saying there's a risk that somebody blows up the whole place here in Europe. But if we avoid that, the future is bright in my view, because then we get into a much more possibility, much better options for a multipolar world in which nobody tries to dominate. And then people tell me, oh, but China will dominate. It's my reading, and I may be wrong, you may say yes or no, it's my reading that China does not have a wish to make everybody follow them, look like them, do like the Chinese, like the Americans have a wish to turn people into that. Rather, that both the Japanese and the Chinese are proud of being unique and not trying to sell, one-party systems or Confucianism or something like everywhere in the world, and they don't build bases all over the place. So I think that if we can hope for that to be the truth about China, then I think that we have a great option to create a more peaceful, democratic, and just world. And I hope I'll live it long enough to see it.
Yeah, let's keep optimistic. With that, we come to the end of today's show. Many thanks to our guest, Dr. Jan Oberg. You can also find us on the CGTN app or on YouTube. I'm Xu Qinduo. Thanks for being with us. See you next time.